Hi, everyone. So, what I want to do for this week's lecture is really talk about the two main things to consider when we're talking about critical reading, or the two first steps. And that would be one, determining what sort of argument or main idea the essay is about, and two, how the author makes that argument or that main idea. And this ties back into a lot of what we were talking about last week as well. It's kind of a continuation of what we were talking about actually. But those are really the two things you want to look for right away when you start reading a particularly long or maybe hard to understand essay or any sort of text, or even a novel, right? A lot of novels seem to take a lot of digressions, or the author seems to get sidetracked. But understanding really what the novel's about, even if it's a work of fiction, there's usually some sort of theme there that you can pick up on. So for that first part, determining what sort of argument or thesis the essay is about, um, upon your first read of an essay, even if it's just kind of quick perusal, you should get some sense or some understanding of what the main idea is. Something should pop out to you about what the author is actually trying to convey. But even then, you still have to read carefully. The author could be writing satirically, like we talked about last week with the Jonathan Swift essay. We can read it and understand right off the bat that his argument seems to be that he wants people to sell and eat their children in order to alleviate poverty. That pops out pretty vividly for us, but we want to make sure that we're reading the essay carefully enough to know that he's being satirical. He's not actually proposing this. He's just highlighting the absurdity of the fact that nobody else has any better solutions. So even a casual read, you should be looking for what sort of argument the author is trying to make. Are they being satirical or are they being serious? If they're being serious, is their argument good or bad? Or you could look for what sort of context they're writing in. Is it unfamiliar to us? Are the arguments that they're making good for maybe their particular audience or their particular time period, but unconvincing to us because we're sort of in a whole different situation and culture? And the other assigned essay for this week, the one by Defoe, seems to highlight that pretty well, I think. His essay, The Education of Women. We can read it through and kind of agree with him right away that he's arguing that women should be allowed to be educated. Now, this was being written back in the 1700s when women weren't always educated. Nowadays, everybody gets education, or for the most part, everybody at least has some schooling, but this wasn't the case. And so when we read his thesis, right away we're on board. We agree with it. He says, I've often thought of it as one of the most barbarous customs in the world, considering us as a civilized and a Christian country, that we deny the advantages of learning to women. And we go, okay, good. And he says a little bit later on, near the end, that all the world are mistaken in their practice about women, for I cannot think that God Almighty ever made them so delicate, so glorious creatures, and furnished them with such charms, so agreeable and so delightful to mankind, with souls capable of the same accomplishments with men, and all to be only stewards of our houses, cooks and slaves. So we can resonate with this argument, right? But then we want to think about how he's making the argument. The first part, yeah, we understand what he's saying, but how is he saying it? Well, the argument that he makes is a little bit strange, because throughout the essay, he talks about how educating women, it does benefit them, but his main pieces of evidence as to why this is a good idea is how it's going to benefit men as well. And there's some sort of underlying assumptions about women in the essay that we wouldn't look to see from an author who would be writing this today. Right after he begins that saying that it's a barbarous custom for them not to be educated, he says, we reproach the sex every day with folly and impertinence. While I am confident, had they the advantages of education equal to us, they would be guilty of less than ourselves. So he kind of seems to be tacitly admitting that women in his time aren't as educated. They're kind of silly, they're foolish, they're impertinent. And that's not an argument that I think somebody would make today convincingly. He goes on to talk about how, um, let me see. He talks about how if women were educated, uh, having to hang around them wouldn't be as boring. They would be capable of having rational conversation, good debate, uh, good just small talk, as opposed to not being able to really say anything when there's a party going on. Arguments like this that really we wouldn't think would be the main point of someone arguing for women to be educated. But that's the argument that he makes, and it's because it's being written a couple hundred years ago to an audience who's probably primarily men, right? So if his audience is men, it seems kind of natural that he would be making an argument to try to persuade men that it's a good idea. He's not writing to women themselves, he's writing to the male population. And so that's what I mean by identifying not just what the argument or what the thesis of an essay is, but also how the author is making this. You want to look to see what sort of evidence they're using, how they're going about persuading their readers of one thing or another. Or if they're telling a personal story, what the message or the main idea of the story is, and then how the stories that they're telling relate to the message or relate to the whole. So that leads us to our kind of next step. And for this, I want to go back to the Buckley essay that we were talking about last week, because I did ask you then to sort of try to categorize that essay into its individual parts. So after determining what sort of argument the author is making, then we need to break the text down into its smaller components to understand how each part contributes to the whole. And once we've done that, we know what the argument is, how the author is making the argument, and three, I can count, I promise, three, how each part of the essay contributes to the author making that argument, or if it does. Now remember, you might read a bad piece of writing at some point in the future. You might read something where you can't figure out what the author's main idea is, or if they have one, they didn't really present any stories or evidence or anything to support that idea. So it's not always that you're reading this text and it's some sort of infallible document. It might be that you're just reading a bad text, but critical reading, or knowing how to apply critical reading skills or techniques, allows you to identify those pretty quickly too. So you know it's bad and maybe not worth your time to read. So to give an example of breaking an essay down into its individual parts, I'm going to hopefully try to screen share my computer and show you a bit what I'm talking about. Okay, so we can see here that I have the entirety of the Buckley essay pulled up in a Pages document on my computer. And you don't have to do this, again, if you want to practice breaking down essays into their individual components on your own. You can always just do this with a pen or with a pencil in your textbook. But I have it up here on the computer just in order to illustrate more clearly what I'm talking about when we talk about organizing an essay or breaking it down. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that I've read this essay through once in its entirety, but there were parts of it that went over my head. Or maybe there were certain passages or paragraphs where my attention kind of drifted, and I think I know what he's talking about, but I want to make sure that I have a full understanding of what he's saying, a full comprehension of his point. The first thing I would do is look for a place where he seems to state his main idea or his thesis statement. And in a traditional persuasive essay, or maybe an argumentative essay, we would look for that near the top, right? Because that's where teachers will always say you need to state your main point. But that isn't always the case, and we can see that it isn't here, because he begins the essay by giving a description of something that happened to him in the past. So I need to do a little bit of digging around for this one, but if I had to pick out a passage that really seems to summarize what his main point is, I think I would pick this one here. He says, "We are all increasingly anxious in America to be unobtrusive. We don't want to make our voices heard. We're afraid that our cause isn't just, or that it's too trivial. And so we're going to sit around and endure things that maybe we shouldn't just in order to be passive and to be compliant. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight this paragraph, and let's make it yellow. And so now I know that that is the paragraph where the thesis statement or the main idea of the essay can be found. And all the other parts of it can be interpreted in light of what I know here. So now let's look at some of the other elements of the essay. If this is his thesis statement, he's trying to make a point. How does he go about proving his point? Does he rely on statistics? Does he rely on other people's studies or stories? Well, not really, right? We know from the very beginning he's telling a story from his own experience that illustrates his point that he's trying to make, that people don't like to complain. So that's at least one story. It's a personal anecdote. He's not relying on data or facts. He's telling a story. That is his argument. And so, what we can do, since we know that, is highlight this entire thing here, where he's talking about being on the train and it's too hot, and he wants to say something, but he kind of feels uncomfortable saying something, and all the other people feel uncomfortable saying something. And I'm going to make that, red. And so we know that this is all one supporting argument or supporting idea. This is supporting evidence number one to go toward his thesis, which again is right here. And then when he's done with this first story, his next piece of evidence is, again, another personal anecdote. Now he's talking about when he's in a movie theater and the screen is blurry, and he wants to say something and he assumes that somebody else will say something, but nobody does. They all just kind of sit through it and bear with it, and they have a bad movie-going experience because nobody speaks up. So we'll make this one, what's a good color? We'll make it this pink color, I guess, and have that be story number 2. So if we started out this essay and we were kind of confused and we're thinking, why is he telling these random stories? The answer to that question is found after story 2, because when we read this thesis, we know, oh, that's what these 2 stories are relating back to. And let's see what we see next. He's still talking about his personal experience. He talks about how he gets a little bit carried away. When he really gets worked up about something, he wants to speak rationally about it, but he's bottled things up so long that it sort of boils over. But before we talk about this, let's stick with our stories, because we already have 2 stories, and I want to see if there's any other places in the essay that can be classified as just story examples. And there is right below this. He talks first about his New Year's Eve resolution to be more assertive, and then about this time that he went to a skiing resort and he asked one of the workers for help because the worker was just sitting in the chair and he thought he was lazy. But then it turns out that the worker had just had a heart attack, and then he felt like the jerk when the ambulance comes and rushes him away. So I'm going to highlight all of this again, make it story number 3. And then again, right after that, we get this last story. He's on an airplane and he needs more paper because he's writing a story. And we'll have that be story number 4 and put it in blue. And then after that, he doesn't really tell stories anymore. Well, actually, he tells one more here, but it's not his story, it's an editor's story. So this is something that somebody else is telling him. So we'll get back to that in a minute. But we can see that the majority of this essay has just been him telling personal anecdotes to support his argument. And that's what a good probably 75% of it is. Now we have the thesis statement identified, as well as his sort of three supporting arguments, which are all stories. At this point, it seems like if you were to rewrite this as a persuasive essay or an argumentative essay, we would have all of the necessary components to making that essay, or almost all of them. We would still need a conclusion, right? And a conclusion in any sort of essay should really highlight the importance of whatever topic's being talked about. It should give relevance to the issue, represent the thesis in a new light. And he does this near the end because he talks about how this tendency to not speak up when we're uncomfortable with something or to not complain when something's bothering us is reflected in politics. And this is back in the 60s. And this is really his whole point of writing the essay. This seems to be where he's going with all this, because he talks about right away how this is an American problem. Americans don't want to be intrusive. They want to kind of just sit back and hope that somebody else takes care of the problem, and nobody really is assertive. And so this could be considered his sort of thesis revisited. What would be a conclusion in a traditional persuasive essay. So I'm going to highlight this, and we'll imagine that to be some sort of a conclusion. And now again, we have a different bit of evidence, a bit that isn't a personal anecdote, and that's this one about the editor of the magazine telling them that all it takes is a few letters of protest being written in to get them to change something, because most people just won't say anything. He says, "We assume a dozen letters represent the unarticulated views of thousands of readers." And so that's a separate section on its own as well. Oh, we're running out of colors. And then at the end, we have one more example relating back to what would be his conclusion. He's talking about politics again. He's talking about how Khrushchev came to the country and how there should have been more posters of protest if we lived in a society where people would stick up for what they were thinking and protest whatever Khrushchev was doing. So I'm going to make that its own section. And again, that might seem a little confusing if you're reading it and not paying attention how the parts relate to the whole. But we know that he's already talked about politics up here, so that's probably the reason why he's using this example, to support the idea here that he's saying. So we have most of the essay highlighted, and we have this part here, and we've already talked about it a bit, where he's sort of going through his own personal experiences again, elaborating really on the conductor story too. I think that this is kind of a continuation of the first story about him being on the train and not wanting to tell the conductor that it's too hot. So I'm probably going to highlight all of this in red. But that's my interpretation of the story. And if you're doing this and you've underlined the main idea or the thesis, and you've highlighted how all the other parts of the essay go toward supporting that thesis or contribute to the whole, and you come across a passage that doesn't really seem to belong anywhere, that doesn't seem to fit, that is where you might determine that maybe the author went off the rails a bit. They went on a tangent. They were talking about something that didn't matter. If it really doesn't fit in with anything else that you've marked or highlighted, it might just be that that's an example of what we were talking about last week, when an author didn't do a very good job in conveying what they were trying to say. They might have said too much. But I think that it links up with the first story, so I'm going to go back and make that red. And actually, you know what? I'm going to make that bottom example there the same color as the conclusion reflection, because it's talking really sort of about the same thing. It's talking about politics. So there we go. Now we have the whole essay sort of categorized. We have our thesis, and then we have the supporting evidence of the thesis, which are personal anecdotes, stories. We got story 1, story 2, still talking about story 1 here, and then story 3, and story 4. And to conclude, he talks about the broader implications of his personal experiences and what he thinks about them. He talks about politics and the country. And so we can see that it's no longer just 5 or 6 pages of block text. Every part of the essay fits in somehow. And that's an example of how to go about doing some critical reading. If you take an essay, you should be trying to look for how what you're reading in the moment contributes to the overall idea of what the author has to say. Now, I still have you all on my computer screen. I want to talk about your next writing assignment. I'm going to give you the assignment as a PDF as well on our Canvas site, but we can go ahead and read it over together now as a class. So the second assignment is actually really similar to the first. It's a review. I have it sort of marked as a summary/review assignment because there is a lot of overlap between them. So a good review, whether it be of a book, an essay, or a movie or documentary, accomplishes 2 things. First, it tells the reader what the text being reviewed is about. Then, it tells the reader why the text being reviewed is worth their time, or if it's worth their time at all. To the first point, a review is similar to a summary. It should lay out the text's main argument or idea and the most important details. A reviewer should be able to accurately sum up what the author is saying in their own words, clearly and concisely. And this requires a keen understanding of the text and necessitates careful, close reading before the reviewer is informed enough to make any statements about it, kind of like what we were just talking about. If I was going to review the Buckley essay and I was going through it, identifying what passages contributed to the whole, and I came across a part that didn't seem to make sense or was out of place, that would be something I would want to say in the review, right? So, as with the summary, certain decisions have to be made when writing a review. What gets included, what gets left out, what does the reader or your audience absolutely need to know? Now, where a review differs from a summary, however, is that the author of a review presents their own opinions or their own judgments on the text. Did the writer of the text get across the point they were trying to make? Was the writer's main idea good? Do you agree with it or disagree with it? Or what parts of the text resonated with you? These are some of the questions that a reviewer should take into consideration. Another thing to keep in mind is that a reviewer is not writing for themselves, but for an audience. It might help to imagine yourself to be a book reviewer, working for a fancy, high-end newspaper or journal. Imagine that you're writing a review not just for yourself or for your instructor, in this case me, but for an audience that relies on your opinions regarding what to read or what not to read. So it requires a little bit of make-believe here. Imagine that you're writing to a broader audience. You have to accurately summarize the essay so they know what essay it is you're reviewing, and think about how your opinion can sway them. In essence, a good review should include a sort of sales pitch as to why someone should pick up the text and read it, or alternatively, why they should avoid it. This would be a sort of anti-sales pitch. It depends on if the review is favorable or negative. As with summaries, reviews are typically short, although the rule that they should not be as long as the text itself doesn't necessarily apply. If a short essay evokes a strong reaction and generates many ideas and arguments in response, a review could conceivably run longer than the text itself. And it often does, especially if you're reviewing a text that you take a lot of issues with and you want to present counter-arguments. In conclusion, all of your reviews should include the following, and some of these are repeating from the summary assignment. It needs to include identifiers such as the text's name, the text's author, and when it was published and where it first appeared. It also needs to use at least 2 direct quotes from the text to support your claim, and by claim I mean whether or not it's worth someone's time to read it or whether or not they should avoid it. You should include what you think an audience might find interesting about the text or what you find interesting about it, and contain a persuasive argument as to why or why not an audience should read it. And like with the summary assignment, this needs to be at least 1 full page, 12-point Times New Roman or a similar font, and double-spaced. Now this review assignment will be due Monday, October 18th at 8 o'clock a.m., and it's worth 12.5 points. Now I gave you all the weekend to turn that in because technically if we had been doing this class live, it would have been due the week before that weekend. But I gave you to the next class session opens up that Monday to turn it in. But keep in mind that that week, midterm grades are due on Wednesday. So definitely try to have it in by Monday at 8 a.m. at the latest, because I'll need to have time to grade them and get them back to you before midterms. Because you don't want to wait too long and then have it not showing up on your midterm grade and have it poorly reflecting your midterm grade when really it was just late and I could have gotten to it. Okay, so that should hopefully give you a sense of what the second essay is going to be about. Like with the summary assignment, I'm allowing you to pick any of the 50 essays in our anthology to do a review on, to work with. And so I would say, however, that I would like you to pick one that is different from the one that you used for your summary assignment. So branch out a little bit, be adventurous. It can be one of the essays that has been assigned for us to read, or it can be one that we haven't gotten to yet, but at least make it a little different from the first one, right? All right, so hopefully that gave you some ideas as to how to go about reading a lengthy text. Always try to break it down into its parts because 1, it makes it more manageable, and 2, it allows you to make sure that you really have an understanding of it when you're done reading. So it's not like you just kind of skimmed it and you have a sense of what it's about, but you don't really know. Because again, I've seen students in the past read the Swift essay, A Modest Proposal, and think he was really talking about eating babies. And more careful reading or breaking apart that essay would have revealed that no, that's not really what he's talking about. All right, so as always, email me if you have any questions or concerns, and I will see everybody next week.